offensive talent and an intimidating physical presence, but is perhaps most renowned for his durability. His professional hockey career spanned 33 years.
Every time we used to go to training camp.
He played longer than anyone thought was humanly possible. He crossed from the original 6 years into expansion through changing rules, new equipment, different coaching styles, and shifting generations of stars. When Gordie Howe stepped on the ice, time itself seemed to bend. He was there in the 1940s when the league was small and brutal. He was still there as the game became faster and more modern. For fans who grew old with him, Gordie Howe was not only a player, he was the constant line running through the history of hockey. Over that long journey, he saw everything. He watched rivalries turn into respect. He saw young kids arrive nervous at training camp and leave as legends of their own. He battled centers who tried to outmuscle him, wingers who tried to outskate him, and defensemen who believed they could push him off his path. Most of them failed. Howe knew every trick in the book because he had helped write it. The elbows in the corner, the quiet stick lift at just the right moment. The calm shot released a split second earlier than the goalie expected. So when people later asked Gordie Howe a simple question, it was never really simple at all. Who were the 5 players he admired the most? Not the loudest names of a single decade, but the men whose games stayed with him as the years passed. He did not rush his answer. He thought of Montreal crowds roaring in the old Forum, Detroit fans shaking the rafters at Olympia, long road trips through frozen winters, playoff nights where everything was on the line, and you had no choice but to find out who could really play. The 5 names he chose say as much about Gordie Howe as they do about the players themselves. They reveal what he believed hockey should be: tough, skilled, honest, and consistent. Before we reach the list, we need to remember who he truly was. To understand that list, you have to understand the man who made it. Gordie Howe was born in Floral, Saskatchewan, a small place in the Canadian prairies where winters were long and hard and the rink was often outdoors. Like many boys of his generation, he started with little more than hand-me-down skates and endless ice. What separated him early was not a perfect stride or a polished shot. It was balance, strength, and a quiet determination that never left him. Coaches could see that he did not scare easily. He stayed on his feet when others went down. When the Detroit Red Wings brought him into their organization, they were not just signing a prospect. They were unknowingly signing the backbone of their franchise for decades. Howe broke into the NHL in the late 1940s, and almost immediately became the kind of player every team fears. He could score like a sniper pass, like a playmaker, and punish opponents physically without losing control of his emotions. Night after night, he took the hardest checks, absorbed the roughest treatment, and kept coming back for more. The record book only hints at his true impact. More than 1,700 NHL games. More than 800 goals in major professional hockey, when you include his WHA years, multiple Hart trophies as the league's most valuable player. Art Ross trophies as the scoring leader. 4 Stanley Cups with Detroit. Yet the numbers cannot fully explain why players and coaches across generations still speak his name with a certain tone in their voice. Gordie Howe defined professionalism on the ice. He did not need to talk much. He set his standard in how he prepared, how he practiced, and how he competed in the corners. Younger players watched him tape his stick, lace his skates, and go through his routine, and they understood that greatness was built one repetition at a time. He respected opponents who brought the same seriousness, the same consistency, and the same courage to the rink. Those are the qualities that guided his choices. The 5 men on his list are the ones who met that standard in his eyes. Number 5. Jean Beliveau. When Gordie Howe looked back across the many eras he lived through, few opponents earned his admiration the way Jean Beliveau did. Their teams were natural opposites. Detroit built its identity on force pressure and a kind of blue-collar relentlessness. Montreal relied on flow, precision, and a sense of timing that felt almost effortless. At the center of that style stood Beliveau, tall, elegant, calm, and impossibly controlled. He never rushed plays. He never seemed bothered by the weight of a game. To Howe, that composure was as dangerous as any slap shot. Their meetings were not just contests between 2 stars. They were a clash of philosophies about how the sport could be played. Howe brought power that came from decades of battles in the corners. Beliveau brought a glide that made the ice look wider under his skates. Yet beneath that polish was a competitor as fierce as any Howe had faced. When the puck dropped in the old Montreal Forum, Beliveau did not avoid contact. He absorbed it, redirected it, and used it to create space for himself and his wings. Howe respected that. It showed a strength that statistics never fully captured. The rivalry grew through the 50s and 60s, as Detroit and Montreal collided again and again in meaningful games. Howe noticed that no matter how many times he leaned on Beliveau, no matter how physical the shift became, the Montreal captain always returned with the same steady expression. That poise impressed him. It signaled someone who understood that pressure was part of the territory. Someone who could elevate his teammates simply by staying composed. Even in later years, when Howe was asked which players felt like true giants when he faced them, Belivau's name came up without hesitation. The respect was mutual, carried quietly between two men who shaped the sport with very different styles, but with the same devotion to excellence. Beliveau never tried to overshadow opponents. He simply demanded their very best, and Howe always felt he needed to bring exactly that whenever they met. Number 4. Maurice Richard. For Gordie Howe, Maurice Richard represented a different kind of challenge. If Jean Beliveau was the calm center of Montreal's dynasty, Richard was the fire that pushed games to their breaking point. The Rocket attacked every shift with a force that felt personal. His stride was short, explosive, and aimed straight at the heart of a defense. Howe had faced many goal scorers in his career, but Richard carried an intensity that separated him from the rest. You could feel when he was on the ice. The temperature of the game changed instantly. Their meetings were some of the most demanding battles of Howe's long career. Richard did not glide into open space. He carved his way there through contact and willpower. Detroit knew that if they gave him even a moment, he could turn a quiet shift into a dangerous one. Howe respected how Richard handled the weight of expectations in Montreal, a city that demanded nothing short of brilliance. No matter how hard the pressure climbed, Richard played as if he were carrying a responsibility larger than himself. What stood out to Howe was not just the scoring touch, though Richard's goals were legendary. It was the sense of purpose behind them. Fans often remember the Rockets' famous glare, but Howe remembered the discipline beneath it. Richard did not quit on plays. He did not slow down in heavy traffic. He did not shrink from opponents who tried to contain him with physical play. If anything, he seemed to grow stronger in those moments. Their encounters defined an era. Detroit versus Montreal. Power versus fury. The controlled strength of Howe against the burning competitive fire of Richard. And through all the collisions and all the intensity, a deep respect formed. Howe knew exactly how rare it was to face someone who played with that level of conviction. Richard brought the game to a place where only the toughest could follow, and Howe always appreciated that challenge. Number 3. Bobby Orr. When Gordie Howe watched Bobby Orr enter the league, he saw something he had not seen in decades of professional hockey. Orr did not simply play defense. He reshaped what the position meant. His stride cut through the neutral zone with a speed that startled veterans. His confidence with the puck forced entire teams to rethink how they defended. Howe had played against legends and alongside future icons. But Orr brought a dimension that felt new, modern, and almost unsettling in its impact. Their few meetings carried the weight of a passing torch. Howe was the established force who had ruled the sport with balance, strength, and enduring consistency. Orr was the phenomenon who arrived with a style that lifted Boston into a new identity. Whenever they shared the ice, Howe paid close attention. He admired the way Orr accelerated out of corners, how he read plays before they formed, and how he turned defensive recoveries into instant rushes the moment he sensed a gap. It was the kind of vision that could not be taught. It was instinct sharpened by fearlessness. What stayed with Howe most was Orr's commitment to constant motion. Some players waited for openings. Orr created them. He demanded the puck, controlled the pace, and challenged opponents to match his tempo. Few could. Howe had faced scorers, playmakers, and bruisers, but Orr was a rare combination of all three. His legs powered the Bruins, his awareness steadied them, his talent elevated everyone around him. Hockey had shifted, and Howe knew it the moment he saw Orr dominate a game from the blue line. Despite their different styles and eras, Howe respected Orr's humility. There was no arrogance in his approach. He simply worked, played, and pushed the sport forward because that was the only way he knew how to compete. To Howe, that mindset mattered as much as skill. It was the measure of a true great. Orr did not try to replace the legends who came before him. He honored them by building on what they had left behind. Number 2, Ted Lindsay. For Gordie Howe, few players shaped his understanding of competition more than Ted Lindsay. They were teammates, line mates, and partners in some of the most demanding years of Detroit hockey. But Lindsay was not on Howe's list simply because they wore the same sweater. He earned his place because he pushed Howe in ways no opponent ever could. Lindsay challenged him in practice in games, and in the quieter moments when a team measures its true character. To Howe, Lindsay represented the pure edge of the sport, the part where toughness, loyalty, and conviction all meet. Lindsay was smaller than many stars of his era, but Howe knew size meant nothing when the puck dropped. Lindsay attacked every shift as if it were a battle he could not afford to lose. He drove to the net without hesitation, absorbed punishment without complaint, and played with a fire that lifted the entire line. He was not reckless, he was purposeful. Every hit, every chase, every scrap had a reason behind it, and Howe admired how Lindsay never let emotion override the mission. He played hard because he believed that was the only honest way to play. Their connection on the production line became one of the most respected partnerships in NHL history. Howe often said that Lindsay taught him what real intensity looked like, not the flash of a single big moment but the sustained force of someone who refused to step back. Lindsay did not expect respect. He demanded it through effort. That attitude reshaped Howe's own approach. Nights when Howe felt tired, he looked at Lindsay and saw a teammate who never coasted, not even in training sessions. It set a standard he carried for the rest of his career. What Howe valued most was Lindsay's courage. Not just the physical kind, though Lindsay never hesitated to stand up to anyone. The deeper kind. The courage to speak up for players, to challenge systems that took advantage of them, and to risk his own standing for something bigger. Howe admired that resolve, even if he himself was more reserved. Lindsay's activism during the early fight for players' rights made Howe see him as more than an athlete. He was a leader who refused to let fear dictate his choices. On the ice, their styles blended naturally. Howe provided balance, control, and strength. Lindsay delivered pressure, grit, and tenacity. Together they shaped Detroit into a force that opponents dreaded. For Howe, it was simple. Many players came and went during his long career, but very few left a permanent imprint on him. Ted Lindsay was one of them. His example stayed with Howe long after their playing days ended, a reminder that greatness begins with how you carry yourself before anyone is watching. Number 1. Mark Howe. When Gordie Howe looked across 7 decades of hockey and chose the one player he admired above all others, he did not choose the most decorated opponent or the most feared rival. He chose someone he knew better than anyone, someone whose game he had watched from the first stride to the final shift. Mark Howe was not simply his son. He was a player who earned Gordie Howe's respect the same way every great professional does. Through consistency, intelligence, and a level of commitment that never wavered. From the beginning, Gordie Howe saw traits in Mark that set him apart. He played with a calm precision that reminded Gordie of the great defensemen he had battled in his prime. Mark did not rely on pure strength. He relied on positioning, awareness, and timing. He read the ice with the eye of someone who understood that speed meant nothing without purpose. That approach impressed Gordie because it mirrored the lesson he had spent his life learning. The smartest players lasted the longest. Their years together in the WHA and later in the NHL were unlike anything the sport had witnessed. A father and son on the same team. Not as a novelty but as legitimate teammates chasing the same goals. Gordie watched Mark grow into a player who could anchor a blue line, turn defense into transition, and carry a team through difficult stretches. Mark's skating was fluid, almost effortless, the kind of stride that coaches studied and young players tried to copy. Gordie appreciated how Mark controlled games without theatrics. He made the simple play, the correct play, the play that helped everyone else. What meant the most to Gordie was Mark's integrity. He played the game the right way. He avoided cheap shots, respected opponents, and competed without needing to announce it. When people later asked Gordie why Mark topped his list, he never pointed to a trophy or a statistic. He pointed to character. To the way Mark handled pressure. to the way he battled through injuries, to the way he kept showing up ready to work even when the spotlight drifted elsewhere. Gordie Howe faced legends. He outlasted dynasties. He saw every kind of star the league could produce. But when he talked about the player who embodied the values he held closest, he spoke of Mark Howe. Not out of sentiment but out of recognition. Mark had earned his respect shift by shift, year after year, until there was no question left in his mind. For Gordie Howe, the greatest measure of a player was not the noise around him but the way he carried himself through the long road of a career. Mark walked that road exactly the way his father hoped the game would teach him. Before Gordie Howe became the face of Detroit, before he became the symbol of longevity and consistency, there was one figure who stood behind his earliest steps and shaped the direction of his career. Jack Adams was not simply a coach. He was the architect of the Red Wings' identity during one of the most demanding periods in the league. Howe always remembered that Adams was the man who looked at a quiet teenager from Saskatchewan and saw the beginning of something rare. Adams believed in building players the hard way. He expected discipline, conditioning, and a willingness to compete every night without excuses. Those expectations were not suggestions. They were the rules of survival in his version of professional hockey. Howe responded to that environment in a way Adams immediately respected. Instead of resisting pressure, he absorbed it and turned it into momentum. Adams pushed him because he knew Howe could take it, and Howe later admitted that those early tests defined the way he approached the rest of his long career. What Howe admired most about Adams was his ability to see potential before it surfaced. Adams knew Howe had balance, strength, and hockey sense that were uncommon for someone so young. Instead of protecting him, he threw him into real responsibility. Important shifts, tight playoff games, matchups against established veterans. Adams wanted Howe to experience everything the sport could throw at him, and Howe grew faster because of it. He never forgot that trust. Their relationship was not always smooth. Adams was intense, demanding, and sometimes harsh. But Howe understood that his coach operated with a single focus: building teams that could win. And for all the challenges, Adams instilled values that stayed with Howe long after Detroit moved to new eras. Prepare with purpose. Play with intention. Respect the game by respecting the work. That foundation shaped Howe into the player the world eventually came to know. When people asked Howe later in life which coaches truly influenced him, he spoke of Adams with gratitude. Not because the two were close in personality, but because Adams forced him to grow into the player he needed to become. Adams recognized his talent early, demanded more of it, and pushed him toward a path that lasted longer than anyone expected. Howe knew exactly how important that was. Gordie Howe played long enough to see entire generations rise, peak, and fade, yet his perspective never drifted from the values that shaped him. The players he admired most were not chosen for headlines or brief flashes of brilliance. They were chosen for endurance, discipline, and the way they carried themselves when the pressure of the sport exposed everyone's true character. Jean Beliveau Maurice, Richard Bobby Orr, Ted Lindsay, and Mark Howe each represented a different part of the game he loved. Together they formed a portrait of what greatness meant to him: strength with purpose, skill with humility, competing honestly no matter the era. Even the coach he singled out reflected those same standards. Jack Adams pushed him, challenged him, and demanded the kind of commitment that would become the core of his identity. Howe never forgot that influence. He understood that the right mentor can shape a lifetime. When Gordie Howe passed away at 88, he left the sport with more than records and memories. He left a blueprint, a reminder that hockey is defined by the people who honor it through their work and their integrity. The men on his list did exactly that. They stood out not only in the moment but across decades of reflection. In the end, Gordie Howe's choices speak as clearly as any statistic. They reveal the game he believed in, the standard he lived by, and the legacy he trusted future generations to carry forward.